After finishing The Dead Zone and then Firestarter almost in tandem, Stephen King turned to writing one of his darkest books, and certainly one of his most claustrophobic and intimate books to date, and that was Cujo. It was in 1977 in the spring. He was then living in Bridgeton, Maine, and he was having problems with his motorcycle. And a friend told him about someone who could handle the repairs out in the country. He drove out and experienced something very much like the Trentons experience in the film. You know, a fellow out in kind of the backwoods who was a mechanic who could fix things, but he also had a dog that was a little mean. And when he experienced that dog, that set a train of thought in motion of what would happen if, you know, someone were put in this situation, and what would happen if it became essentially a siege set in this one location. And that became Cujo. People always wonder where the name Cujo came from, because it's not to be found in a Spanish language dictionary, for example.
His name's Cujo.
Cujo?
It appears to be an invented name that Stephen King adapted to the dog. It's now obviously connected with Stephen King and with evil dogs, although I know some people who've named their very nice dogs Cujo.
He's a great dog.
The book begins in a very interesting way because its opening sentence is "once upon a time," as if this were a fairy tale, and sort of leads the reader, who by now had been accustomed to Stephen King as being a writer of supernatural horror, into this landscape that's very much filled with realistic pain, anguish, and horror, and that's not going to end in a good way. It begins once upon a time like a fairy tale, but it ends in a very, very bad way. In the final pages of the book, Ted Trenton, the boy, dies. And Cujo was a very successful book, but there were people who had some problems with it because of that downbeat nature of it. Did it do as well, and has it continued to do as well as a seller as some of his other books? I don't think so, and I think in large part it's because of the darkness of the book.
The second film that I ever directed was a film called Alligator, which was a horror film spoof. And Stephen King saw Alligator and called Dan Blatt, the producer of Cujo, and told him that he should meet with me about possibly directing this film. I'd read the book. I was excited about the possibility of doing this film because it had all the ingredients of what I consider a good horror film. It was about two kinds of fear. It was about real fear and imaginary fear. Dee Wallace's imaginary fear is that she's going to grow old and useless and bored in this little town in Maine. The husband's fear of financial insecurity, the little boy sensing all this fear and tension and stress in the household, begins to imagine monsters in a closet. And ultimately, in this particular story, when a real fear, the rabbit St. Bernard, entraps her, it puts everything into perspective and the family's able to unite. So I thought it was a very worthwhile idea. Dan Blatt and I got along, and I think as far as Dan was concerned, I was the guy for the job. However, at that point, the film was set up at a studio, and the person in acquisitions at that studio had different ideas about who should direct it, and he was unmovable. So they wound up hiring another director to direct the film. Then the original studio backed out of the deal, and it was on the market. So I called Dan, and Dan said, well, yesterday we just made a deal with Warner Brothers, and so we're proceeding with the same director at Warner Brothers. A week later, I got a call from Dan Blatt saying, we're thinking of making a change. If we do, would you be interested? Yeah, I said.
I told Lewis when I called him on the phone, I said, listen, if I hire you, you're going to have to come up here, you're going to have one day, and then we're going to start shooting again. And there was a long pause, and he said 2 days. And I said, fine, we'll shut down for 2 days.
The big thing that Lewis brought, especially at the time he came on the movie, was an incredible professionalism, a calmness. This is the way we're going to do it. And any hysteria that had been, previous to his showing up just went away. And we felt we were really in good hands, and then it became a real team effort, and everybody pulling on the same end of the rope.
Stephen King had written the original draft that I'd read, and I felt that he had strayed too far from the book. And So Dan and I talked about bringing in another writer, and while I was away from the project, that writer came in, and what this writer did, which I thought was brilliant, was go back to the book and edit it down. In every respect, it was a terrific script except for one. It was way too long. So we brought in another writer who made changes where necessary to streamline and reconnect the story after we'd eliminated subplots. In the book, the dog was a reincarnation of a bad guy from a previous book. And I toyed around with various ways of showing or suggesting that there was some real supernatural element in the closet. And I couldn't come up with any solution to that with our means at the time that wouldn't seem hokey to me. And I decided to eliminate any suggestion that there was really some kind of supernatural monster in the story. When I replaced the original director, certain elements were already in place. I changed some of them, but I also kept some of them. The cast was originally selected by Dan Blatt, the producer, and the original director, and the cast was fantastic.
Dee, she's from Kansas. She's a middle American girl, and I think that's why Steven Spielberg chose her to do E.T., and that's why I had chosen her before E.T. on The Howling.
Getting Dee was quite a coup, and that was really Dan Blatt kind of calling in a bit of a favor, although I think Dee really sunk her teeth into the part. So starting there, we felt in really good, good hands.
It's a tour de force role for a woman, and I'm always looking at the different layers in a movie, but for me, you go, wow, this could happen. It's easy for you to put yourself in the character's positions.
And I think that there's something very relatable about her that's real, so that when the audience sees her, she's a woman who's involved in a marriage that's not working.
You had to care, and you had to care from everybody's perspective. But most of all, the relationships with the two men were important to sort of set up the sadness of Donna's life and the need in her life. But ultimately, it was all about the connection between this kid and this mother. And any mother can tell you what that connection is. I mean, I would die for my kid in an instant.
Daniel Hugh Kelly had never been in a movie before, and we read him in New York.
Dan was extremely nervous. This was a really big shot for him. And he had just come off of soap operas where they work entirely differently. Everybody in the show worked differently. Christopher and myself live together. We work absolutely from a different place. So here you have three people coming from entirely different points of view as far as how they prepare for their part. And somehow, you just come together and you honor each other. And for me, that's the high of acting.
But the movie was going to rise or fall if we could find the right kid. And we went all over the country looking for the boy. And Danny Pintor was from New Jersey.
My mom was a hairdresser in New Jersey. She had a picture of me on her mirror, and every one of her clients would just say, he's so cute, you should send his pictures in and have him go to a modeling agency. And she took Polaroid pictures of me and sent them to this agency, and the next day they called with a job for me. And then it just never stopped.
It was also interesting that Danny Pintor was 6 years old and couldn't read yet. So that he worked with his mother, who was there all the time and who was fantastic, and he memorized his lines, but not because he could read them.
Can my monster work that?
Looking at the movie now and reading the book now is how I gained perspective, because when I was 6, I had no idea. I was just so excited to be amongst all these people and in this car that didn't have all the pieces.
In a strange kind of way, he and Dee were the same kind of actors. They really operated from the inside, and I think whatever strengths the picture has, those two together were pretty powerful.
Danny was the most incredible child actor I think I've ever worked with, and they've all been great, but what we asked Danny to do and the places we asked him to reach for a 6-year-old, I mean, The fact that he even understood where those places were was amazing to me.
Stephen King lives in Maine, and most of his stories are set in Maine in the fictional town of Castle Rock, as was Cujo. But we wanted to shoot, because of budgetary restraints, in California. So we went up to Northern California and filmed most of the film in a town called Mendocino, which had a lot of Cape Cod type architecture, was on the coast, and we thought would be a pretty good double for Castle Rock for Maine. The exterior of Dee Wallace's house was a facade that was constructed on a hillside because it had a beautiful view of the ocean in the background. We wanted to take advantage of that. And then the interior was a completely different house.
And then, of course, she goes to a farm to get the car fixed. And we found the location in Petaluma.
Hello?
I hired a production designer by the name of Guy Comtois, and he had a lot to do with the look of the picture. He was from Montreal, and he also turned out to be an absolute fantastic, incredibly hard-working production designer.
In the beginning of this film, when Danny Pintero, character Tad, has to turn out the light, I constructed that whole sequence based on a little game that I used to play when I was 5 or 6 years old. I used to enjoy imagining that there were monsters under my bed, a wolf under my bed. And the trick was to flick off the light switch and somehow get into bed before the wolf could come out from underneath, because the wolf could only come out in the dark. So I decided to toy with that idea and had a lot of fun with it, because the cinematographer, Jan de Bont, was a person who would accept any challenge. And when he does click the light off, I built 2 sets. There was a normal size set that we saw when the lights were on, and then there was an elongated set when the lights go off to increase the distance that he has to travel, which I amplified even more by shooting it in slow motion.
No tricks, no visual effect, and it worked so effectively. And I was like, I think that's exactly what a kid feels. That's what I felt.
That set was so incredibly cool. I loved that set. Because they had described it to me earlier as, oh, you're going to run through this room. I had no idea. And then I saw it, and I was really totally just amazed that they'd built this.
And then as he dives towards the bed, I told Jan de Bont what I'd like to do is have a shot of him running towards the camera in slow motion, and then go underneath the camera and have the camera tilt down until it's completely upside down, so that as he dives into the bed in slow motion, we get the feeling that he's falling into space. And I can't imagine any other cinematographer being able to do that. We were on a very tight schedule, but he constructed a little platform in the room. You could support him and the camera, so he could actually operate as the boy ran under the camera and turned the camera upside down.
It was just this kind of meld of talent that, brought this thing up. We look at the dailies and you just sort of, oh my God, how are we doing that?
We shot this film in the middle of winter, and when we went to shoot the scenes in the barnyard with Dee Wallace trapped in the car, the point of the story is that it's very hot and she's dehydrating and her son almost dies, and it was raining most of the time and it was cold. It was down in the 40s on a lot of the days when we were shooting. We were literally coming out and shooting between raindrops when there'd be a break in the rain, and Dee Wallace and Danny are virtually unclothed in those scenes. It was awful.
The working conditions were so hard and emotionally so difficult. And finally, I said, guys, you just have to put some heaters in the car, because Danny had no clothes on, So they did, which of course caused some sound problems. So we'd have to turn the heat off every time we rolled. And I had to look hot, so they wanted to use glycerin, but I hate the way it looks. And on top of which, rain or no, there are flies everywhere on a farm. And they love anything sticky. And I had Currier syrup on me with the blood.
We were fighting it all the time in order to simulate the weather, and that's where Jan was one of the great contributions Jan made to that picture.
Yeah, it was so difficult to create heat, so we sometimes had to put like flames in front of the lens to create a false sense of heat.
Every day of that shoot was taxing. Every day was. And the water that she pours on me is actually hot water, because it was that cold. It was freezing. And here we are, you know, being spritzed with sweat to make us look like we're actually dehydrated. The movies, you know, you'd never know.
It was not your typical Stephen King, and we thought this is such a cool way to do a horror movie that doesn't have a supernatural element to it. Although we thought it was daunting at the time of how we're going to get this dog to do all this stuff.
Stephen King absolutely loves animals, and I think you see that in the book Cujo. Cujo's a good dog. You get inside Cujo's brain, and Cujo wanted to be a good dog, and bad things happen. He's bitten by a rabid bat. So it's really a curse because there's no going back from that.
Perhaps the biggest, or one of the biggest challenges of making this movie was to make a St. Bernard scary. St. Bernards traipse around the Alps with little kegs of rum under their chins to save stranded hikers. They're friendly, named after a saint, Bernard. So the challenge was to make a St. Bernard scary. A lot of that challenge was met by the animal trainer, Carl Miller, who was three-quarters animal himself.
Carl said to me, there are no St. Bernards that are trained. And at first he says to me, why don't you use a different kind of dog? He said, you know, I have lots of Dobermans and things like that are trained. I said, that's not going to happen, Carl. I mean, it's going to be a St. Bernard.
And I'm convinced that he was communicating with the dogs telepathically because he had an incredible talent to get the dogs to do what we needed them to do. He's the one that actually cast the dogs, and he cast 10 dogs in the movie.
We had, I think, 6 or 7 dogs.
My number is 7. That's the number I've always used. 7 dogs.
5. 5 dogs. Everybody says a different number, right?
Oh yeah. It was very amazing to me, the numbers of Cujos we had. It's interesting to me that the different St. Bernards were trained to do different things on command.
So in any one sequence, later in the film where the dog attacks the car, I might be intercutting 4 or 5 or 6 different dogs who are required to serve different functions during the course of the scene. And no dogs were hurt during the course of the filming. We had a man in a dog suit, we had a mechanical dog head, and we had as a backup a dog suit that we could put on a Labrador Retriever, which we never actually used. In some of the sequences, we'd use all our techniques together. There's a scene where the dog rams the car and dents the door in as the dog runs towards the car. I removed both doors, took out the front driver's seat, so the running dog could run at the car, jump into the car, and run out the other side. Then in the final editing, I cut the scene as the dog jumped into the car to a flash shot of the man in the dog suit throwing himself towards the side of the car, ramming the side of the car and seeing the metal crumple, and would cut inside to Dee Wallace screaming, then back outside to yet another dog.
But in truth, notwithstanding all of that, there was really one main dog, and that was Mo. And it was pretty incredible.
The one dog that was really the star dog and the most important to the movie was the one that had to terrorize the car, that would run to the car, run into the car, jump on the car, try to put his head through the window, open the door.
I think one of the things that makes the movie so spectacular is the tie-in shots between the actors and the dogs, and these very elaborate moving shots and setups in which you saw the dog and the actors in the same piece of film together.
It was a challenge with the dogs because they'd have to bring all of us on the set, and we would literally have to be emotionally ready, and then they'd bring the dogs because they would be putting this whipped egg white all over him, you know, for the foam. So the trainer had to work them as soon as they put it on because they'd lick it off and then we'd have to start all over again.
And so that makeup had to be applied immediately before every shot. And then hopefully we'd have an interlude with the dog not licking its jowls, trying to get the stuff off its face, in which we could get the dog to perform whatever action we needed it to perform.
I remember the smell of the dog food, but they also had put some sort of scent on this little fake rat that they would put in front of the dog's nose. And in fact, when he did get into the car, all he did was go and snatch the rat. He'd gotten what he wanted.
And, you know, from here up, they look like they're going to absolutely, you know, eat you to death. From here down, we had to tie their tails in all the long shots because their tails were going like this because they were going to get their toy, you know.
The dog's first attack might come in the fog when Billy Jacoby, playing Brett, goes out looking for Cujo and finds him in the fog in an eerie landscape. That landscape was actually there, but the day we were going to shoot that scene was one of the rare mornings when there was no fog, but we had a backup plan. We had rented what they call a naval fogger, a machine that was used during the Second World War to hide battleships at sea and puts out an enormous amount of steam. And the local fire department saw suddenly this huge column of smoke coming up from this hillside, which looked like a forest fire. So fortunately, it was towards the end of the scene that the fire trucks arrived, so we didn't lose a day of shooting. That was the scene where we originally planned to use the Labrador Retriever in a dog suit. And in the fog, I thought I could hide the fact that it looked phony, and instead it would lend the movements of the dog a eerie, abnormal flavor to it that would make it spookier.
Cujo?
It just looked silly, so we wound up not using it. And we were able to get what we needed with the dog menacing, then recognizing Brett and deciding not to attack him. It's probably the last moment in the film where the dog has any sense of who he is.
Cujo!
I had a very good collaborative relationship with Jan de Bont, and I wanted to keep the camera moving. For example, when Dee Wallace first drives into the barnyard in the Pinto with Danny and the car stalls, I wanted to get the audience to scream. So the shots in that scene were very carefully planned to achieve a certain effect. What I did is I led the audience to expect the dog to attack at a certain time from a certain direction, and nothing happens. Just for a second, long enough for the audience perhaps to relax, and then the dog attacks from the other side of the car, smashing into the glass, with accompanying sound effect and music and scream and everything, and it worked perfectly. Every time I went to the theater, the audience screamed and jumped out of their chairs at least 1.5 feet. Since Dee Wallace and Danny Bottero were trapped inside this car, which is not very large, a large part of the challenge was to be able to film it in interesting, different ways so the shots didn't become repetitive, and to be able to get the camera into awkward, concise, tight situations.
So I remember I said, Lewis, I have to get a minimum of 5 to 6 of those cars, because I'm going to cut them up in pieces. I want to make sure that each time the camera is inside this car, I want you to know how small this car is. That means the camera has to be in there, and to be able to do that, I have to cut up the car. So the camera is right there with the actors. But the good thing was that a lot of cars were for sale, you know, so we bought a lot of cheap used cars, and I had to, our special effects guy cut it in pieces. And I think that creates this incredible drama.
And then Jan de Bont bought another car, which he used to mount a camera on the roof with a periscopic lens pointing down into the middle of the car so that we could film that 360-degree shot.
And what I did is I cut a hole in the roof, and that was a photographic lens that I could stick to the roof, and I had built like a brace that I could rotate the camera myself. And I couldn't see through the fence, so I just tried to guess each time where they were. And I turn around, stopping him, stopping her, and then move around on the roof.
The thing I remember more than anything else was the spinning camera shot that was set on a pole in the center of the car, and it spun around and spun around and spun around to the point where it became dizzying. And it was an interesting piece of creative cinematography at the time, which I was really quite impressed with.
What I love about the movie most is that it's got some really dramatic stuff going on. And I think that's what makes the movie stand out a little bit, is that it's not just blood and gore. And if anything, there isn't that much blood and gore. It's all about the tension and the stress levels and the looks in Dee Wallace's eye when she sees that dog.
Please, God, get me out of here.
A lot of the success of this film comes from the extraordinary performances of Dee Wallace and Danny Patero. And Dee Wallace needed nothing to get her motivated.
She and I were together every day working on that movie, and she and my mother became really close too. Obviously, she sort of was feeding off my mother for that energy, and so the three of us sort of had this really great relationship. Just sitting in that car, waiting for the filming to start and waiting to get to that moment of intensity.
I have a minor in psychology, so I was really aware that kids that age, you know, they don't distinguish fantasy and reality. It's not a monster, it's just a doggy. And so before every scene I go, okay, Danny, you know this is pretend. You know the doggy's not really gonna hurt us. So you're not scared. He went, yeah, I am. But it was really important to me to keep telling him that we were just pretending. And then after the scene was over, I go, okay, you know we were just pretending, right? You're okay?
Dad!
Because that wasn't really happening to us. And I hope in some way I helped keep him balanced through all of it, because I sure needed somebody to keep me balanced.
But there's that one moment where I'm just over and over again, I want my daddy, and she just loses it.
All right, I'll get your daddy!
It's how a mother would react in that moment, you know, and that's what makes her so believable. Every moment, she's just, bam, there's no question about it. You totally get it.
It's interesting because when we saw it in dailies, we all kind of went, whoa. And Dan said, oh, Dee, I don't think they'll like you if we use this. I don't think we can use this. And I said, you have to trust your audience, Dan, because any parent has been to the point where they lose it with their kid. And I'm not yelling at him. I'm yelling because I can't save him. And any parent is going to understand that. So God love him, he kept it in. And I have so many letters from mothers especially that say, oh my God, I've so been there. I know that moment.
If there's any story that people truly remember, it's when I was having the seizure in the car. And I remember my mom sort of talking to Lewis, the director, because when I was a baby in the hospital, I had stomach flap problems, and that caused me to have a seizure.
Dad, wake up!
So I talked to him, I said, so you remember what it's like? And he said, I think I know how to do this. I mean, the kid was just, he was like, you know, working with a 30-year-old in a 6-year-old body. And I didn't have to act. I was just along for the ride. He just made it effortless. I went home every night and said, thank you, God, that I got this kid.
I do have a physical memory of every time she put her fingers into my mouth, I'd actually bite her fingers. And that's why she's screaming ow at me, because I'm actually biting her. But it just brought it to another level.
Audiences see people being shot, stabbed, blown apart, maimed. They continue to eat their popcorn and say, oh, it's just a stuntman or it's just a special effects. But when it comes to human violence toward animals, they don't feel the same way. And I was aware of that and concerned about it. So that when I shot the scene where Dee Wallace gets out and actually has to fight with the dog and fend it off with a baseball bat,
Come on in!
I was very careful to never show her actually hitting the dog.
In the novel Cujo, in the final pages of the book, Ted Trenton, the boy who's besieged in the car with his mother, dies. And it's very dark, and it's very bleak, and that isn't what happens in the movie, obviously. Now, Steve King had the opportunity to write a screenplay adaptation of Cujo, which he did. It was not ultimately used, but in his adaptation, the boy lived. And the reason for that was that he said to me that this is the one book that if he ever went back and rewrote a book, this would be the one. That it had gone to this really dark place in the end. The boy had died, and he always had felt uncomfortable with that. He felt it was the right thing to do for this novel. But still, if he could go back and rewrite one book, that this would be it, and he would rewrite the ending so the boy lived. So in a way, he was able to have it both ways by attempting to adapt a screenplay that was ultimately followed, at least in the end game, in which the boy lived.
When Dan Blatt told me that Stephen King had been the one that recommended me for the job initially, I called Stephen King to thank him and talked a little bit. And he told me in that conversation that even though Tad had died in the book, that he didn't think that would be such a great idea for the movie, that it might be too depressing in the context of the movie, that you can get away with things in a book that you can't in a movie. And that clued me into the fact that he would be responsive to any changes we had to make in order to make the movie work, at the same time respecting the story. I enjoyed using the conventions of the horror film genre, and one of them is that no matter how dead the monster is, he's never really dead. He can always come back to life and still can come crashing through the window for a final scream.
My son, who was quite young at the time, said, "I'm never going to be scared by this," and I was watching him when that scene came up. And when that dog came through the window, he levitated about a foot off of his chair, and he said, "You got me on that one."
Sometimes the most difficult process of conceiving a story is to come up with the right ending. We toyed around with epilogues and scenes after the scene where Daniel Hugh Kelly arrives back on the farm and the family's reunited. But ultimately we decided just to end with a freeze frame at the point that they embrace, because at that point the point of the movie has been made, which is that if a real lethal fear comes into our life, it'll put a lot of our other more less lethal imaginary fears into perspective. After looking at the first dailies that I was shooting, I was very happy, and I couldn't wait to see the scenes cut together. I started going into the editing room on weekends to look at scenes edited together and was extremely disappointed. And so I decided to change editors. And I hired Neil Travis. And he started editing things from scratch. And suddenly scenes started to come to life.
Lewis and Jan did a very good job as far as creating a mood and a tension. The only thing that I would say that I probably brought to it was a knowledge of the fact that you want to try to direct people's attention in the wrong direction in a thriller. You want to tell people to look over here, and then something jumps at them from where they're not looking.
God, you scared the shit out of me.
It's just mainly to create an atmosphere of the unexpected.
You think about all the great movies, you'll think about the music. So music is one of the 3 or 4 most important elements in the movie. And Charles came in, he's a real musician, and he has a tremendous heart.
The music in this film, I was particularly pleased with. Charles Bernstein wrote the score, and I met him after the film had been completed. And the music was all appropriate and effective. And with Charles, almost all of it worked from the get-go.
Cujo is a St. Bernard who is, as I like to say, done in by 2 bats. First by a flying bat and then by a baseball bat. Now, if you take the score to Cujo and you listen to it, 90% of it, 80% of it is very pleasant, family, emotionally warm music. And that's part of the mosaic in Cujo. The trick in Cujo, for me, was how to integrate these elements so that it doesn't sound like I've written two scores, one for the family and one for the evil spirit in the dog. Interestingly, if you recall the first scene, it's really very idyllic. When I scored that scene, I had not written a theme for Cujo yet. So I scored the little bunny running around and the dog chasing it and all of that. And then it wasn't until Reel 3 that I started to get a feel for what the music for Cujo should sound like, what his personality was, what that element that is the dark element was going to be. I was thinking about my friend John Williams, who's the greatest composer that I can think of, what he did with Jaws. And when I wrote Cujo, I thought, low French horns for Cujo, that's what I'll do. As I said, it was Reel 3 when the theme occurred to me. So I had to go back to the beginning of the movie and plant it on the shot when the dog first appears. I remember having a discussion with him about the music being so idyllic at the beginning that people might think they were going to watch a Disney-type movie. And so they came up with the idea of a title card, which was a swirling pool, and then the name Cujo came out. And I said, well, you know, we could use the Cujo theme over the title and let everybody know they were going to see a scary movie, and then get light, having promised them that later something will happen, and we all resonated with that idea. I also believe that one of the musical tools of fear is relentlessness. And what you have there is a kind of relentless, the dog is relentless, you know, it's not going to lose interest and go away. So it's that aspect of the dog that is absolutely primitively relentless on getting whatever it is the dog wants, which is flesh in this case. So the music basically evokes that.
I think the score was extremely contributory to the success of the movie. And sound design also.
Most of the growls in the movie are actual dog growls, a lot of which we recorded in sync when we were shooting the picture, when the dog's actually growling. Some were done in post-production and added to sweeten the soundtracks. We actually brought in a man who was very good at creating dog sounds, growls and whines. And we just went through the whole picture, and every scene with the dog, he would put in some sound effect and try to give that dog just a little bit more emotion.
What are you growling at?
And then you treat it and you slow it down or you twist it somehow in the sound work, and it comes off sounding great.
And so the sound effects of the dog and the music all would work in concert with each other.
I knew we had done some terrific things. There was no question about that. I knew that when we were shooting it. Whether the entire picture as a whole would have the emotional impact that an audience could grab onto, I wasn't really sure till I saw it with an audience.
The first time we previewed it, during the first half of the movie, they were sort of moderately interested, but in the second half of the movie, they cranked all the way up to extreme interest. And so the studio, in their infinite wisdom, said, well, why don't we cut as much footage out of the beginning as we can to get to the most exciting part quicker. And then we previewed it again, and it was real interesting because the interest level at the beginning of the film was about the same. And in the second part of the film, they didn't care as much about whether Dee survived or not. And the interest level in the second half of the movie peaked out once we put the character footage back. So that proved to me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that developing characters that the audience can understand and care about is critical.
Every single person that worked on this picture, every single person in every category poured their soul into this thing. It was quite something to see. And each one of these people was a very different person. And everybody had a point of view.
Any movie that I do, it takes me about 3 times. The first time, I think my career's over. The second time, I remember all the stuff that was going on the set. you know, and all the challenges and everything. And the third time I can sit back and go, wow, that's a pretty good ride. You know, I can look at Cujo now and go, there's not much I would do differently.
I was not traumatized at all. I was, if anything, I was extremely fascinated by the equipment, by the blood on the dogs, by the way that there was actually someone on staff whose job it was to do the paw prints on the glass and make them look like they had looked the day before. That stuff fascinates me. I've had dogs my whole life, never terrorized by the animals. If anything, I love them more. There was nothing scary about being on that set. We're just good actors. We just make you think we're freaked out.
On a sad note, Christopher Stone, who played Dee Wallace's lover, did a terrific job, and he is Dee Wallace's late husband, and he's no longer with us, and his contributions were enormous and well appreciated. I love this film. I think it's my best work. It's the most accomplished film that I've ever made. Of course, I can't take sole credit for that. Thank you, Dan Black. Thank you, Guy Comtois, the production designer. Thank you, Jan de Bont. Thank you, Dee, Daniel Hugh Kelly, Danny Pintero, and all the other people involved with the film, because they all contributed to making this a great film.